Good evening and a warm, if not chilly, welcome to the 13th World Horse Welfare Wednesday Welfare Webinar. That's a mouthful. You're joining us by Zoom, and a very warm welcome to you. Thanks so much for joining us. We're just going to mark time slightly whilst we wait for our Facebook Live followers to join us as well. Now, joining us by Zoom, if you've joined us before, you'll know that you'll be able to take part in a couple of poll questions just to get you engaged, but also you'll be able to ask questions of our two presenters this evening. And if you could use the Q&A function to do that, if you're joining us by Zoom, rather than the chat function, by all means, the chat function to talk, to make comments, but please, for the Q&A, if you can use for the questions, use the Q&A function. And a warm welcome to those who are joining us by Facebook Live for this evening, our 13th World Horse Welfare Wednesday webinar. It's great to have you with us, and we've got a really exciting lineup for you this evening, but it's very much about engagement. So if you're joining us by Facebook Live, then please share the video. If you are joining us and you enjoy the evening, please remember that we do record them all, and they're all up on our YouTube channel, the previous 12 and tonight's, which is around winter challenges and keeping our horses fit during the course of the winter. And I'm delighted to be joined by Sir Mark Todd, well famous for being a World Horse Welfare patron, and also by Jon Phipps, one of our very own field officers. So this evening is all about winter, but before we get on to that, and before I introduce Sir Mark, I want to just get you to take part in a quick poll question. If you're joining us by Zoom, you'll be able to respond to this. If you're joining by Facebook Live, by all means, put a comment in the comment section on Facebook. So before we do that, and you think I would know exactly what I'm doing, which I do. I've just got to share my screen with you, and then I'll be able to go forward to that. There we go. So maintaining your horse's fitness and health during winter. So let's get on to this poll question. Do you find it hard to maintain your horse's health and fitness during the winter time? And we've got a series of options there, from yes, my horse struggles in the winter with various issues, to down to no, my horse manages well throughout the year. Not a test, just to get a feel for who's there and the challenges you've got, and we can certainly refer to that. The format for this evening is going to be a presentation from Mark, a presentation from Jon, and then we'll have a good half hour for questions. Obviously tonight's on about winter challenges. We've done a whole series of webinars. If you've got any ideas for what we might cover in future webinars, then please do email us at education@worldhorsewelfare.org. Now, normally I would talk to you around just a little bit about the work of World Horse Welfare, but this evening, this week is the Big Give. An initiative that supports charities like World Horse Welfare. So if you can give tonight, your donation will be enhanced by the Big Give initiative, meaning that we'll be able to help even more horses. Now, if you were with us a fortnight ago, Claire Gordon, our Chief Field Officer, told the story of Chelsea, and it was an extraordinary story of one of the cases that came into our Somerset Centre, Glenderspooner Farm. So it's a wonderful example of what a difference your donations can make. Now, we're going to put in the chat function, and also on Facebook Live, we'll put in the link. So if you are able to make a donation, however small, it will be enhanced by the Big Give, and will be able to us to help more horses this winter. And I think we recognise that this winter is going to be very challenging. So the aim of these webinars is to sort of help us as horse owners be better horse owners. And winter can obviously be a really challenging time for many people, depending on your facilities, your setup, and also what you're aiming to achieve with your horses. For some, it's very easy to rough their horses off and let them get hairy and muddy, which they like to do, whilst for others it may actually be an easier time. So we recognise that all horses are different, all situations are different. So tonight's about giving you some practical tips, and I'm delighted to introduce Sir Mark, who as we know, is world renowned for his eventing career. I'm not sure whether he ever had a Steve Redgrave moment of, if you ever see me on a horse, shoot me, or you ever see me on a horse again, shoot me, after he retired first time, but he retired a second time. And of course, across those, that his career was completely stellar, winning 2 Olympic golds and being one of only 2 people to win back-to-back Olympic titles since the Second World War. Since retiring, well, he hasn't retired at all. He's moved into the world of racing as a racehorse trainer. Currently has 15 horses in training. So, Mark, before I hand over to you, I will just see what we've got in terms of. Well, he hasn't retired at all. He's moved into the world of racing as a racehorse trainer. See here the answer to the to the poll question. So a clear majority there for not. Do you find it difficult to maintain your horse health? Not overly, but I do worry more in the winter. Well, you've come to the right place tonight. I really hope tonight we can provide some practical tips to decrease those concerns. So, Mark, without further ado, I am going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Rolly. Hold on, I've got something stuck on my screen, so I'll just try and get rid of that. Just before I start, talking about Steve Redgrave moments, I did actually have one. I said to my wife after the Olympics in 2000, or just before the morning of the cross country in 2000, which was going to be my last event before I arrived, I said, if I ever say that I want to do this again, just remind me how terrible I feel at this moment. And of course, I retired for 8 years and then had completely forgotten about it and came back again. So it does happen. But anyway, yes, winter time, certainly not my favorite time. Normally, I like to be taking off to warmer climates of New Zealand at this time of year for the summer. But of course, that's not happening this year. But for the horses, I mean, as you've rightly said, it means different things to different people and different horses. When I was competing in eventing, certainly in the early days, there were definite seasons. The eventing started in sort of mid-March and it finished in November or the beginning of November. And then we used to rough the horses off. We'd put them out in the field and they'd have 2 months in the field. And then you get them back in the beginning of January and start up again with your month's road work and build up towards the start of the season. But of course, you know, it means different things to different people. The winter time for some people is their busy time, where if you're a hunting enthusiast, this is when you've got your horses in work and they're doing at their peak fitness. If you're into winter racing, jump racing, or even flat racing, it goes all the way through now. You know, you've got horses in work, as we have. There doesn't seem to be these seasons now. It's, you know, if you're in eventing, you can now go down to Portugal for the winter and you can compete down there. So it's pretty much 24/7. And also, people's attitudes or science has changed a bit. Like I said, we used to chuck our horses out in the field for 2 months. It's now proven that this is maybe not the best thing for them, particularly older horses. It takes too long to get their fitness back up, and for their own well-being, it's not such a good thing for them. So probably now, or certainly before I finished eventing, the horses would only have a maximum of 3 weeks total rest, and then they'd be ticking over doing something, going on the walk or 2 or 3 times a week, just doing something to keep their body moving. I've got a few notes here, and I need my glasses to see what's going on. Turnout, you know, it's as has sort of been mentioned a little bit. It so depends on where you are. We're very fortunate where we are here. We're on top of a hill, so on dry land. You can pretty much drive over our property 12 months of the year and never gets too wet. But you know, when it rains, and it seems to be raining an awful lot more these days, it does get wet. And with the race horses now, I don't turn them out in the winter. I love horses to go out in the field, but I find that they plough the fields up. That really annoys me. It's, you know, if a horse is living out, they tend to sort of just relax in the field or whatever. But if you've got them stabled and they're fit and ready, you go and turn them out in the field, especially if they're 2 or 3 years old. It soon looks like the Beaufort hunt's been across your field several times, and they've ploughed it up. They've pulled shoes off. They've got themselves tangled in a fence or something. So I just find for the months from now through to probably February sometime, when it starts to, or March when it starts to warm up, the horses stay in. We maybe hand graze them, but I like to save the fields for the summer when we can turn out, and we do turn them out every day when the weather's nice. When being from New Zealand, which has supposedly got a warmer climate, and being skinny, I feel the cold. So, and I think we tend to look after our horses as we do ourselves. So we don't have field shelters, but if horses are turned out for the winter, I like to have a rug on them. Because, you know, with the weather that we get nowadays, when you turn them out, two things you've really got to look out for is mud fever. No matter how dry your property is, you're always going to get mud, and particularly if your horses have got white feet, your chances are you're going to get mud fever. And the other thing, because it does get so jolly wet, is, and if you don't have a rug on, is rain scald. And I've seen some really nasty cases of horses where literally their skin peels off their back from rain scald. So that's why I always like to have a rug on. I mean, I'm talking about dealing with thoroughbred horses, so they are much thinner skinned. They're not sort of hairy fat ponies that have a good thick winter coat on them. Mud fever, will just sort of divert a little bit. It's one of those things that I don't know that anybody has found the perfect cure. I was talking to Jon just earlier, and he's got one cure that he believes in. We've tried all sorts of different things over the years. We've tried putting goose grease on when they go out, which actually gives a protective layer to the skin, which can help. All sorts of different remedies of trying to cure it. Vets come up with special lotions and potions, and sometimes you find that one will work on one horse but not another, and another one will work on a different horse, and 1 year it'll work on one horse and it won't the next. And so I think you've just got to keep trying and doing the best you can to keep it clean and not get too infected. But it's certainly something you've got to keep a check on. With turning out as well, like we've got young thoroughbreds out in the field, yearlings, 2-year-olds, and their requirements are going to be a lot different to, I've also got old Campino, who's 18 years old, who's a warm blood. He's now retired. He's out in the field. He actually plays nanny to some of the young horses sometimes, but because we have to feed the young horses so much, because they're growing, as I said, they're thoroughbred, they use up a lot of energy to try and keep warm. We have to pump quite a lot of feed into them. But if we let him do the same, he'd be so fat and probably get laminitis. So you've got to be very careful and with what you're feeding them. Campino, he just gets a bit of hay during the winter because he's, like I say, he's in really good condition. He doesn't need to put on weight. He now grows a really thick coat, so he keeps himself a bit warm. He still has a rug on. But also, if you've got rugs on horses, and it does pay to sort of keep a check on them, because sometimes you think, oh, well, they've got a rug on, they're doing fine, and then you get them in and you pull the rug off after a month or so, and you find they're not as good looking in such good condition as you thought they would, or B, they've got grossly fat, and the rug has covered it up. So I think it always pays to just check on them, look under their rugs to see what sort of condition they're in. Obviously, if it's freezing weather, we've got to remember water pipes freeze, water troughs freeze, and that can sometimes, if we have a bad winter, it can last for a week or so. And if your horse's water trough is frozen over, it means, even in cold weather, they do need water to survive. So that's another thing you've got to regularly check on. If we do have a really cold winter, we have to go around every day breaking the ice off the water trough so that they can actually get to drink. The other thing is, for horses that aren't in the field, we always used to find the winter time was a good time for educating the horses and schooling. If you're found during the year that you have a problem, or you have a horse moving up the grade, it's a good time to catch up on the training. There's no pressure on of competition, so you can spend the time and just take your time to work on moving up to the next level in the training or fixing a problem. You can always go and have more lessons because you're not at competition, so you have the time to do that sort of thing. We did have for a while have the advantage of having an indoor school, but going out in all weathers, I think one thing you've got to, the nice thing about the winter is when there's no pressure on that for competition, that you don't actually have to go and school every day. You can, if it's a foul day, they're going to be much happier if you leave them in the stable or put them on the walker, rather than go out in the driving rain expecting them to perform well with their head tilting or trying to turn their backside to the weather. So I think, as I say, you're not under any pressure, so a day or two missing is certain on the schooling is certainly not going to be a disadvantage. You might be, it's also another good time to, when we're not so busy, to this time of year we've got yearlings coming in from the sales and breaking horses in, so which is another thing I really enjoy doing. New horses, new toys coming in, and it's discovering what new talent you might have, and basically it's a time for recouping and getting ready for the coming season. We have horses that will stay and work right through the winter. We've got a few that are racing, but it's also a time to plan ahead for the following year with what might be coming up. I don't think I really have a lot more to say on the subject. So if anybody wants to ask any questions, or we move on.
Brilliant, Mark. Thank you so much for that. I think that's really sort of got a number of really interesting thoughts going, and certainly the point you made at the beginning around the year-round nature of so much activity now, and also and horse sport is a real challenge. And I think that actually that's going to come up with Jon's presentation as well. So what we'll do is we'd love to hear questions, and we've got some coming through on Facebook and the Q&A function, so please continue for those to come through. And I will now, before I introduce Jon, I'm going to share my screen again, and we will go to a second poll question. See if I can do that. So when thinking about your horses management throughout the winter. What do you feel are the most challenging aspects? Now, we've got a number of different options here. So horses fitness, horses weight, horses physical health, horses mental health, climate or weather, available turnout, access to professional support, opportunities to compete, opportunities to ride. Yes, that's it. So there's a series there, but give us your top three. What do you think are the biggest challenging aspects of a horse's management through the winter? Whilst you're answering that, I'm going to introduce you to our second speaker, who, as I've mentioned already, is a World Horse Welfare Field Officer. My screen seems to have, let's go on to the next one, there we go. Who Jon's had two very different careers, a very successful one in the world of IT in London, and then had a complete change of direction and joined the RSPCA for 15 years. And then last year joined World Horse Welfare for the southwest part of the country. Like Mark, he's most famous for the fact that he's a rehomer from World Horse Welfare, he got another horse from Glenda Spooner Farm, our Somerset Centre, Solomon, who is actually a thoroughbred. Came in unbacked as an 8-year-old, and Jon took him on in June this year. So I'm sure Solomon will feature heavily during his presentation. And he's keen to do some riding club events at some point in the future. So Jon, we wish you all the best with that. And with that, hopefully Basil will be able to give us some results on the poll question. What are there? So the biggest challenge is a real sort of mix there, not surprisingly, but access to professional support and opportunities to compete are not significant issues, but everything from horses fitness, certainly climate and weather, which I know Jon will talk about, and opportunities to ride are the biggest challenges. So some great food for thought there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to hand over to you, Jon.
Thank you very much, Roland. Let me just do the honours here. With my background in IT, I have no excuse not to get this right, do I? So let's go on to that. Lovely. Right, good evening. Thank you everyone for joining us. And before you get a chance to bombard Sir Mark Todd with all your questions, I'm just going to spend a few minutes just chatting to you tonight about some of the issues that we as field officers see over the winter, common things that we see, and how those issues are changing slightly now as we go forward. Now, traditionally, a lot of welfare issues in horses could really very simplistically be summed up in one sort of phrase. They get too fat in the summer and then they get too thin in the winter. And to an extent, that is still the case. And as we go into winter, myself and my field officer colleagues around the country will no doubt come across the usual problems and find horses suffering from what I lovingly call the winter quintet of doom. Now, these are factors that when you take them together can create huge problems for horses over the winter. So obviously you've got the weather with the lower temperatures means that the horses start to use up their reserves of fat for warmth and energy. And this is often magnified when they suffer from a lack of any decent shelter and a lack of food. So generally in wintertime, there are lower levels of nutrition in the grass, although I will revisit that later. And sadly, in the cases that we see, there's often a lack of any supplementary food in the way of any hay or haylage. Parasites, sadly, again, often the horses that we deal with have large untreated parasite burdens, and that's internal parasites in the form of worms, external parasites in the form of lice and feather mites. And this is a particular concern towards the end of the winter when encysted redworm can emerge and cause huge problems for horses that may already be in a really poor condition. Throw into the mix pregnancy, any mares in foal are often reaching the latter stages of their gestation periods towards the end of the winter, ready for a spring foal. So, and as such, their nutritional requirements are much higher. And similarly with young stock, the nutritional needs are higher as they're growing. And these tend to be the horses that we find that are bullied away from any feed that is provided by the other horses. So when you get the combination of all or most of the winter quintet of doom, you end up with all too familiar welfare cases like the one on that slide and sadly these ones on this slide. And incidentally, just looking at these photos, the World Horse Welfare Conference was held online a few weeks ago, and it considered the horse-human partnership and what's in it for the horse. Well, not much, I think you'd agree, on the partnerships for these horses. But anyway, this simplistic view of the issues faced by horses at the different times of the year, it is changing and becoming a little bit more complex than what it was. And while people may disagree on the cause, there is little doubt that our climate is changing. And winters in this country are now becoming warmer and wetter. And you can see from this slide that 2019 saw a number of temperature records broken, and 6 of the 10 wettest years since 1862 have been recorded since 1998. You'll see a list of counties there that were flooded. Interesting about the lack of ground frost, and even today on the radio they were saying that more records have been broken for temperature in 2020. Similarly, for the increased rainfall that we've been experiencing now at the times, you'll see at the top of the slide, it rained for 81 consecutive days in a Welsh village that I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce the name of, back in 2016. So this changing climate is beginning to present us horse owners with new and different challenges that we need to be able to deal with. Now, in my neck of the woods, the southwest, the winters of the past few years have seen literally months of often incessant rain, often accompanied by storm-force winds and unseasonably warm temperatures. And this sheer unrelenting rainfall has often left previously well-draining paddocks either flooded or poached to the point where they're nothing but an absolute sea of mud. I've seen horses literally up to their mid-cannons or even hocks in mud with standing water all over the fields and no dry areas left at all. And I've even seen natural underground springs that nobody knew existed suddenly appear in the middle of paddocks and flood the whole area as the water table was so high. Now, the vast majority of the owners of these horses were not negligent and uncaring, far from it. Most of them had their horses on that land for years without any problems, except for the usual muddy gateways or poached areas. And land that had previously been fine supporting the number of horses on it suddenly just couldn't cope with the deluge. Now, those of us that work in welfare and deal with horses have always had calls from concerned members of the public about horses in muddy fields. And generally, horses are pretty tough and they're able to ride out muddy conditions without too many problems, as long as they have dry areas where they're able to get out of the worst of the mud and they're not showing any ill effects physically from their predicament. There isn't a huge amount that can be done. They just generally tough it out. But some of the conditions that we've started to experience lately are much more extreme than that. And owners that are facing the biggest challenges, I find, are where they have had their horses on grass paddocks with no access to any hard standing or stables. If the paddocks become completely waterlogged and poached, the chances of horses suffering from conditions such as mud fever, as mentioned by Samar, or hoof abscesses, it increases with the wet conditions. And if this happens, how on earth do you treat them if you just can't get them out of the mud? And also, the incessant rain accompanied by strong winds can drive water up and under the coats of some horses, leading to other conditions such as rain scald. And this can be exasperated where if the horse then rolls or has to lie down in the thick wet mud, and it causes bacteria from the soil to enter the rain scald sores, and that causes secondary infections. And where the horses are in these conditions for weeks or months at a time, other conditions such as thrush, seedy toe, overreach injuries, thrown shoes, tendon tweaks, all of those can occur. It's almost an endless list of winter grief sometimes. And it's not just those people with only grass paddocks that are feeling the brunt of the wetter climate. I know of a livery yard in Devon that last winter, for the first time in 30 years, had absolutely no turnout available for the horses on the yard. Every single paddock was either underwater or completely poached, and it had never happened, and they've been there for 30 years, never happened before. And whilst these conditions take their toll on the horses, they also take a heavy toll on the owners as well. I've seen people literally broken physically and mentally trying to deal with these conditions. I've encountered injuries such as dislocated shoulders, broken ribs, and a severe concussion due to people falling or being knocked over in the mud. And sadly, one lady burst into tears the minute she saw me arrive, as I unwittingly became the straw that broke that particular camel's back on that day. And for that, even in the worst of the conditions, and when it gets horrendous, for those who choose to ignore it and just say, well, it's winter and there's nothing they can do, they may find this attitude problematic from a legal point of view. So under the Animal Welfare Act 2006, any owner or person responsible for looking after horses has a statutory duty of care towards them. Part of this duty of care is to ensure that they have suitable environment in which to live. And according to the codes of practice issued by DEFRA, a suitable environment includes one that is safe, free from hazards, and has the provision of a well-drained lying area for horses to stand and lie down on. And in the past few years, some paddocks have poached so badly that vets have certified the conditions have become unsafe and totally unsuitable for the horses, and asked that they be removed immediately. So as well as the increased mud, the changing climates producing other issues as well. It's warmer, and these people that find that they do have grass left may notice that it's now growing for longer and is more abundant with the warmer temperatures, which is happy days for some owners. It might mean they can delay the winter hay rations being fed, and this could lead to lower overall feed bills. And those horses suffering with some of the issues in the winter quintet of doom that I mentioned earlier, they might just find enough grass to keep going a bit longer and keep condition better than they would have done previously. For others though, this abundance of grass in the winter months, it can create further problems. Those with overweight horses that need to use the cooler winter temperatures and lower nutritional value of the grass to help shed some excess pounds may be faced with continuing to fight their horses' flab by strict grazing, using grazing muzzles and soaking their hay. All of this at a time of year when traditionally they were able to relax a bit and let nature help them out. And in early February this year, I helped remove a grossly overweight and severely laminitic pony from a field in Cornwall. The owners had thought the grass was safe at that time of year, so hadn't been worried. And following the results of a British Equine Veterinary Association study in 2019, that over 30% of their horses the vets were dealing with were overweight, Vet Jill Moffat of Seadown Veterinary Group in Hythe said the warmer, wetter climate was a factor, as it was leading to an abundance of grass and making it more difficult for owners to be able to regulate their horses' intake. So given that we can't change the weather, how can we best adapt to these warmer, wetter conditions? Well, part of my role as a field officer for Ward Horse Welfare is to conduct home checks on prospective new adopters of our horses. And for me, the area off of the grass is as important, if not more important, as the paddocks themselves. In my opinion, the single most important thing to have wherever you keep your horses is an area of hard standing. Somewhere off of the grass and somewhere where you can confine your horses if necessary. This will not only get them out of the wet mud, but for those with concerns about weight control, it gives you an area where the horse's feeding intake can be strictly monitored. It will also give you a chance to treat the abscesses, sort the mud fever and the thrush without it getting reinfected, and importantly, without you getting injured trying to do it. Now, this hard standing area, it doesn't need to be concrete. A stone aggregate, such as one known as 803, with a sand surface on top, it will do the job fine. And it actually has the advantage that it lets the water drain through it, which concrete won't. Now, if you rent the land, you'll obviously need to get permission from the landowner, and you will need to check with your local planning office that they have no objections. And when planning your area, try to make it near an access gate to make life easier for yourself so you don't have to trudge through the mud to get to it. And also make sure it's big enough to comfortably be able to confine all of the horses in it should it be necessary. And sadly, just putting the aggregate down on wet soil is unlikely to work. It will just sink and mulch in. So ideally, the top surface should be pulled back and then the aggregate applied. Now, if you're unable to get a hard standing area put into the paddock and the paddocks are already poached, the other options you've got are to provide a straw pad or perhaps a wood chipping pad so that the horses have a drier area to rest and lie down on. Now, both these options are only temporary, and you will need to put a lot of either straw or wood chips down initially and then keep it topped up for it to be effective. So as these materials are organic, they will rot, but they can provide very useful temporary relief when done properly. Be careful if using wood chip to ensure it's from a source that's safe for horses before putting it down, as some of the plants may be poisonous or they may contain toxins that can affect the horse's hooves when they stand on it. Rubber field mats may be of some use, but again, they're best put down on a hard surface rather than straight down into the mud where they can just sink when the horses stand on them. Other options when the weather gets really bad, can you move the horses? Well, by the time the weather conditions get this bad and this wet, this may not be an easy option if you haven't already got somewhere planned. landowners and farmers are understandably unlikely to want to rent further fields for horses with the conditions so wet, and livery yards may well be battling the conditions themselves, so not want to add to their problems. However, it may be worth some inquiries to local farmers or landowners, as some may have areas of their yards they're not using during the winter, which they may be more amenable to letting you use rather than another grass paddock. And for this option, fencing such as the portable metal Harris fences is often very useful to create temporary enclosures and can be hired relatively cheaply from tool hire shops. This, with some rubber matting or straw bedding, can actually create a good temporary solution, giving everyone some respite from the conditions and allowing treatment to be given effectively and safely. And this is something I've seen used a couple of times where people have put their horses up into a yard, and it is really effective, and it's given everyone a lot of relief towards the end of the winter. And once you have a well-drained lying area sorted, some other things you can consider. Thought that was going to go wrong. There you go. You could consider whether a lightweight zero fill rain sheet is appropriate for your horse. Now, this will help to keep them dry, helping to prevent rain scald, and it will take the brunt of any mud when they're lying down and rolling. Now, these can be especially useful if the rain is constant and your paddocks are very exposed or they lack decent shelter, which stops the horse from being able to dry out properly. And of course, as we said, you'll need to keep spare dry rugs handy and do careful daily checks under the rug to ensure the horse is remaining dry. Consider whether putting barrier creams on legs before they start to develop issues with mud fever would be a good idea. Creams such as udder cream, pig oil and sulphur are often used for this purpose, especially in horses that are vulnerable to such conditions or have had it before. And similarly, consider what you could apply to the hooves to prevent thrush developing before it takes hold. Numerous oils that you can use. Stockholm tar is an old remedy that some horse owners swear by when it comes to this. And the use of overreach boots to prevent shoes being pulled off and overreach injuries, but check them daily to ensure that wet mud isn't being balled up and trapped underneath them. For those of you that do have stables or outbuildings such as barns to move the horses into, gradually start to introduce them to being in for longer periods before the worst of the weather hits, and consider what you could provide to your horses to make their enforced confinement a bit more manageable. So we're looking at boredom busters, different size hay nets, etc. If there is a group of you and you have access to a sand school or an all-weather surface, perhaps see if this can be split up into sections so multiple horses can get out for exercise and, importantly, socialise at one time. And perhaps see if you can arrange a rota amongst yourselves to help with the bringing in and the turning out during the work hours. And for your overweight horses, a bare paddock which is not completely waterlogged could be very useful actually in helping with winter weight loss. Remember, horses need constant access to forage, especially in the colder months. So for your chubsters, use lower calorie alternatives to hay and haylage where possible. You could consider using barley or oat straw as part of their daily hay ration, use soak hay again, and use a variety of hay nets placed at different areas around the paddock to encourage them to keep moving. Obviously, be careful to introduce any dietary changes slowly to give the horse's stomach time to adjust to the new food. Another thing to do is consider clipping the horse. Over the winter, a number of the ponies in our care at Glenderspooner Farm in Somerset, they'll get a bib and a belly clip, just to encourage weight loss. And when it comes to rugs, only use a lightweight rain sheet to keep your horse dry rather than anything heavier unless the temperatures drop off dramatically. And remember, just because you're cold doesn't mean your horse is. And the usual advice, try and get into the habit of regularly assessing your horse's weight. So either by body scoring, the use of a weigh tape, or if you've got access to one, a weigh bridge. And this will really help to allow you to see if your cunning weight loss plans are working or whether it's all going the wrong way. Remember to treat each horse as an individual and resist the one-size-fits-all approach if you've got a number of horses, which really may not suit some of them. Now, as for your mangled paddocks, remember any residual worm larvae in the soil may survive longer with the warmer temperatures. So think about how you rotate your paddocks in future and consider whether cross-grazing with another species such as sheep may be practical, as this will help lower the worm burden and can generally increase the quality of the pasture. Now, one of our previous webinars from a few weeks ago was with one of my colleagues, John Burns, a field officer in Scotland, and it was all about pasture management, and it contains some great advice about how to keep your paddocks healthy. And you can find this webinar on our website or on our YouTube channel with all the others. And also, I would recommend looking at the Equicentral system of horse care. There's a website address on the slide there. Now, this is a system developed originally in Australia by Jane and Stuart Myers, and is a method of managing your horse and the paddocks in order to try and maximise the health and well-being of both the horses and the paddocks. It's well worth a look, and it's a different type of system, and it involves using a central yard, which the horses always have access to. So, of course, one of the biggest factors in whether the warm, wet winters mean you end up with a quagmire for a paddock or an abundance of grass making your horses too fat is how many horses you have on the land. Too many horses on too small an area will likely mean they'll all be sloshing around in the mud once the rains really start to kick in. And with the wetter conditions we're experiencing, the traditional 1 horse per acre will be nowhere near enough in certain areas, especially if the intention is for the horses to live out all year. You've got to start thinking not only about the availability of grass for food, but about the mud that's going to be generated. If you're considering taking on a new horse to add to your herd, be honest with yourself. Can the land actually sustain another set of hooves charging around on it? And for those of you with now too much grass, you may need to be thinking ahead and restricting the grazing in winter in a similar fashion as you would for the other seasons of the year. Consider whether some of your paddocks could be reserved for hay and not grazed out at all, or whether they be let out for part of the year for sheep to graze on. It's not just the winter that's changing. The very dry and warm spring stunted the grass growth, and where horses were not being given supplementary feed, some either lost condition or didn't improve at all after the winter. So as a result, I encountered several very thin horses in May and June. So in 2020, I've encountered obese laminitic ponies in the middle of winter and thin, hungry horses in the middle of summer, which is the opposite to what you'd normally expect. And also the extreme once-in-a-lifetime adverse weather events, such as the beast from the east, now seem to be almost an annual occurrence somewhere in this country. And it's important that those of us with horses, wherever we are, start to think when and not if these events are going to happen to us, and to always plan ahead. The important thing is to anticipate problems, as always, and act before they become an issue. The golden rule, as it always is with these things, prevention is better than cure. Thanks very much for listening.
Jon, thank you so much for that. Lots of advice in there, and I noticed we put up a couple of the links that straight through to the World Horse Welfare website around winter welfare tips, but also I was interested in the definition of a chubby chubster. I've never seen that before, but obviously a number of us really find it difficult to keep the weight off our horses, and we gave you a link to the right weight tips that we have on our website too. So that's brilliant. Listen, thank you. So between Mark and Jon, we've got lots of ground to cover. We'll in cricketing metaphors, we'll start with a nice loosener for you, Mark. You're on mute, so you'll need to come off mute. If you were in New Zealand in the winter, would your routine be much different to that in the UK? You're still on mute, Mark. We just need to get you off mute.
There we go. No, winters in New Zealand, well, it depends where you live in New Zealand. You know, if you're up in the north, it's semi-tropical. If you're down right in the bottom of the south, it's very close to the Antarctic, so it's cold. And you know, Jon touched on this too. It's, you know, because I also am involved with a company that does rugs and what have you. What rug suits a horse in one country or one part of a country needn't necessarily mean it suits in another part. So where it's warmer, you don't need big, thick, heavy rugs. And where it's colder, you maybe do need something a bit warmer. But no, New Zealand it's pretty much the same sort of thing, and you get the same problems. You know, you have low-lying, wet areas where it just turns to an absolute mud, or you have better, higher ground that stays dry during the winter.
Brilliant, thank you for that, Jon. Question from Jennifer here about is it a concern to turn horses out on frosty grass?
There's a debate about whether the whether the sugars are higher on the frosty grass, and so whether they're more prone to laminitis. And I think there is some evidence that the fructose levels may be higher. I think the general advice is, if your horse is one that would be prone to laminitis, then I think it's best to avoid the early morning times, if you do have a choice of when to turn them out, and turn them out when the frost has gone. But I think it does depend on just how prone your horse is to laminitis, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's been a subject of great debate, but generally, actually, because obviously it's around colic and laminitis as well. So but I think it's certainly not clear cut, isn't it? And I think it's a great example where, as ever, horses are individuals. Mites, Jon, I'll come to you again. How do we deal with mites in horses? Actually, we got someone who is dealing. She's got a World Horse Welfare pony or horse called Violet, and is working with the vet because they've got mites in the feathers.
Yeah, the feather mites are a real pain, because they can live off of the host for a considerable amount of time. So when you've got lice live on horses, and they generally don't live off of the horse for very long, but mites do. So mites that live in the feather, you can clear them out of the feathers, but they'll live in the bedding, and they'll live in the stables and in the nooks and the crannies. So it is a real problem. And similarly, what Mark was talking about with different treatments work for mud fever and for some horses and don't work for others, it's exactly the same with mites. What works for one horse won't work for another, and it may work one year and then doesn't work the next time. But the real thing is not just the mites on the horse, it's the mites. You've got to clean out the stables, the bedding and everything, and try and get the whole area cleaned out, because they will just leak back on again.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Mark, obviously you talked about exercising in the winter, and if you're not going to school for a couple of days, then it's not particularly a problem, as long as they can get the exercise. Are there any tips that you can give for ways to keep horses fit with limited facilities, for those who don't have a school or whose hacking is limited?
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? And especially like if you have a lot of snow or you have frozen ground, like even we've got a lovely outdoor school, but if it's wet and then it freezes, we can't get on it. We're also very fortunate that we have a walker, a covered walker, so they can go on that. But if you don't have those sort of things, even if you can lead them up and down the drive or do something to get them out so that they can get moving, and it doesn't have to be for a long period, but if you can do like a couple of times a day just to get them out of the stable or off the pen or dry bit of ground that you've got them on, just so that they can have a bit of exercise.
And something that we do quite a lot at our centres, and obviously we're very fortunate to have facilities, but pole work is a really good way of exercising horses, and so you can be fairly sort of innovate to what you've got, even if you don't have a nice arena.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, if you're doing pole work, you've got to have somewhere to put the poles, and it's quite difficult if you're sort of just going up the road. But yeah, anything like that, and it's also good mentally for the horses to do different things with them, and like you say, pole work, and you can be as imaginative as you like with poles. I mean, when we're training the horses, we do a lot of work with poles on the ground. I mean, not only the youngsters, but the advanced horses as well. You can create a lot of situations, and it's very good for them.
Brilliant. Thanks for that. Jon, a question from Facebook. I mean, you mentioned obviously weight and the chubby chubsters. How do you balance providing ad-lib hay in the winter and a good doer?
So with the ad-lib bit is really important, but you can substitute the hay for lower calorie alternatives. So what you're looking at really is to try and introduce things like barley or oat straw, which are easily digestible for the horse or the pony, and it will fill them up, and it will, if the weather's really cold, it will turn on that internal burner so it will keep them warm, but it hasn't got the calories of the hay. Now, obviously, you've got to introduce that slowly. But the horse I was talking about in my size, the grossly obese one that we took out the field in February, well, that one actually went onto a very strict diet of almost entirely barley straw. It was moved onto it very carefully. And so she spent pretty much the whole of the spring and the summer on barley straw with a little bit of hay, and her weight dropped off beautifully. And now she's literally half the pony that she was. So that's the way of doing it. I mean, you can continue to soak hay if you've been soaking hay in the summer. That may not be so practical in the winter, but I would certainly trying to introduce straw. We tend not to use wheat straw, just because I think it's lignin, I think that's in the wheat straw, which makes it not very digestible and can potentially cause a few issues, colicky sort of issues. So we tend to stick to barley straw or oat straw. And in fact, the donkey sanctuary will feed almost their donkeys entirely on barley straw. So that's what they use, because they're very prone to weight gain.
Brilliant, thank you. Mark, I don't know if New Zealand do, but Emma's made the comment here that the UK needs support to have outdoor exercise areas. It's difficult to get permission for these. I don't know if you have any New Zealand perspective on that, but Williams asked, with the lack of daylight and limited time to exercise and only an outside school, is there a best method to maximise fitness via lunging or riding?
I don't know there's a best method, but lunging is certainly if it's late, you've been working and it's 5 o'clock and it's dark, certainly lunging a horse on a circle is probably going to be a bit safer than getting on and riding it. It depends what you're doing. If you're just wanting to exercise the horse rather than actually school it or do something like that, then any form, lunging, long reining, and if you're riding, trotting and doing transitions, walk, trot, canter, that sort of thing, and changing reins and just keeping the horse balanced and going forward.
So, I mean, variety is the spice of life on that basis.
Absolutely, and as you say, put a few poles down on the ground and do some trotting over poles, and even raise poles makes the horses work a little bit more. If you want to do a bit more exercise, it makes them work a bit harder. Lunging in a chambon or something like that, so that they actually work a bit more on a frame, can help put muscle on the right places. I think anything you can, if the horses are in a stable, anything you can do to get them out and get them moving is a good thing.
Brilliant, thanks, Mark. Jon, again, so I know this one, they call it chunky rather than chubby. If you have a pony that's quite chunky, would chaff be too fattening?
Chaff?
Chaff, yeah.
Chaff? No, generally not. I mean, you can get low-calorie alternatives and molasses-free chaff. So no, I mean, chaff is generally okay in moderation, because it is something else that they're eating, so you are adding to the ration. But no, if you are going to give chaff is generally all right. But do get a low-calorie one. So there's you can get, so like say, some that are low-calorie, some that are molasses-free. So go for one of those ones.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, Mark, you've covered this already, but I just thought maybe you could just take us through how my thoroughbred is an ex-racer. This is his first winter out with access to large shelter. He has mud fever. How can I get rid of this?
Good luck. I mean, you can ask 10 different vets, and they'll give you 10 different things. I think first of all, you've got to keep it. You've got to get it clean, and then you've got to get it dry, and then, like I say, we've tried all sorts of different things over the year, from nappy rash cream, pseudo cream, different creams that vets have given us, and I don't know whether you can get it over here, but in New Zealand we used to have a thing called sunlight soap. It was a yellow bar of soap, and washing it and cleaning it with that actually helped with some cases of mud fever. It's, some vets will say you've got to bandage it, put a antibiotic cream on and bandage it on and keep it dry that way. I've never found one method that actually works for all mud fever. So I think you've just got to try a little bit and experiment. But you know, the cleaner and dry you can get it. You know, if they get really bad, you know, you might need some sort of antibiotic to, if a fungus or something's got an antibiotic to kill that off as well.
Yes, they can get infected with bacteria, but I think we could put up the link on the World Horse Welfare website to mud fever treatment, and you know, you're absolutely right that you've got to get it clean and then dry, and until you can do that, and it's in terms of how you do that, I think, as you've said, Mark, there's various different ways and of doing it, and it's a classic example. And we're always saying, you know, when you're training your horses, you know, you use different training programs, I guess, because the horses are individuals, and this is another example where horses are really, in this sense, individuals.
Yeah. And you know, I think their general health too. You know, if a horse is really healthy, it's a bit like us. You know, if we're really healthy and we have a good immune system, you're more likely to fight it. So you know, maybe it's worth, you know, feeding an immuno booster or something like that as well.
Yeah. Jon, quick question, and before, if should I sterilise clipper blades after clipping feathers that have mites?
Yeah, I would definitely. I think I mean, it's a good idea to do that anyway, but I think you'll probably have eggs and things like that around, which you could well have on the clippers. So absolutely, I would. Yeah, I'd play safe and just absolutely sterilise everything around and give yourself half a chance of getting on top of it. Brilliant.
Mark, then in terms of there's a question here, so I'm just you mentioned turnout getting trashed, you know, by the horses over the winter. Does that make you more likely to leave horses in the stables? But you've also talked about the importance of getting them out.
Yeah, well, I'm horses that are in work during the winter, they don't go out. They might go out once a week or something like on their day off. I try and save a certain number of fields so that when the good weather does come, that we have some decent turnout for the horses. We might sacrifice a couple of fields where we'll have horses turned out, and then in the spring, obviously, when those horses come in, we might have to reseed, harrow, roll, what have you, and put it back into place. But I don't know, it's just something and you know, obviously we're in a different situation to people that just have pleasure horses or hacks that aren't in serious work. Our ones are, and if they're not going out on a regular basis, you know, they can do quite a lot of harm to themselves, quite apart from tearing around and ripping up your field. So that's one of the reasons we don't do it so much in the winter.
Brilliant. And do you find, you know, in terms of if the horses you've got in, do they get bored, and how do you prevent them getting bored?
You know, it's funny. Horses are creatures of habit, and if they're used to being indoors and then you chuck them out, they might be happy for sort of like half an hour. Then more often than not, you'll see them at the gate saying, "Please bring me in. I don't like this cold weather." If you've got a young colt that's you know, gets bored, we might give them a ball or something in their stable to play with and keep them amused. Whatever happens, as I said, you know, we're very fortunate. We've got a big 8-horse walker, so they get exercised in the morning and they always go out in the afternoon. So they're out of their stable. So they're out of their stable at least twice a day.
Right, fine, yeah. And actually, interesting question, so I'll come to Jon in a second. Do you think rider fitness is just as important as horse fitness as you head into the new season? Sorry, for you, Mark.
Oh, for me, sorry, I thought it was Jon. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big advocate of rider fitness. You know, because I've you know, done a lot of teaching over the years, and you see, people that are out of condition themselves, and then they wonder why they can't get their horse to sort of do what they want them to. So, if you expect your horse to perform to a certain level, then you physically have to be capable of doing that yourself. And, I found, as I got older and I was competing, I had to do more and more myself. When you're young, it's very easy because you're naturally fit and what have you. The older I got, the harder I had to work at keeping myself fit. And there's a lot more information out there. When I started riding, you never heard of core fitness, but the more I learned about it and the more I did it, the more I realized exactly how important it was. I mean, it gives you more stability in the saddle. It gives you a stronger core if things go wrong when you have to try and save yourself in the saddle. But like I said, if you expect your horse to be an athlete and do athletic things, then you have to try and be an athlete as well. And our diet becomes equally as important as the horses.
Yeah, absolutely. Jon, how can I help my horse that is prone to colic? Worming seems to trigger it especially, and obviously I don't want not to worm her. She's 26 and she's been like it since she was 3. She's on a prebiotic. Is there anything else I can do?
Oh, that's really going to be one for your vet, really, you and the vet to discuss. I wouldn't like to really suggest anything. As they're getting older, particularly, I think you need to be more careful. We don't routinely worm anymore, so we do worm egg counts. Now, whether actually it might be, if you do a worm egg count and send that off, it might be that your horse doesn't actually need worming, so you don't actually need to do it. So I would initially do that. I would do a worm egg count and see what the levels are, and then maybe have a discussion with your vet, because they'll know the history about what you've tried before and what maybe does trigger and is safe. Particularly if you've got horses like we saw in the Winter Quintet of Doom, those really thin horses, we would never say to an owner to worm anything like that without a vet in attendance, because those if you worm something in that sort of condition with one of the strong wormers, you'll cause all sorts of problems. So so my advice would certainly be get a count done first and see what your issue is, and you may find that you don't actually need to do it.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Actually, and there's been quite a lot of comments actually, and I should have picked up on it earlier, but obviously, we've talked about different ideas in terms of treatments for mud fever, and people have quite rightly said it's really important to patch test just to check there's no allergic reaction. So when you're trying a new potion, whatever it might be, just to apply a little bit and just check that there's going to be no reactions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for those comments. Mark, Joanne has asked, how much workload per week to keep a horse fit enough for the odd dressage competition, prelim to medium?
To do a prelim test, they don't need to be that fit. But you've also can't expect your horse to go out and perform a dressage test if you've done no work with it. So I don't know, it's how long is a piece of string? I mean, it depends on the horse as well, and the age of the horse. But I would say 20 minutes a day, something like that, and 6 days a week, 5 days a week. And some of those days might be just sort of walking or something like that. Like I said, to do a 5-minute dressage test at a low level, the horses don't need to be that fit. If you're working at a higher level and obviously asking the horse to engage a lot more and use itself a lot more, then they do need to build up to that level of fitness and that level of work.
And we had an excellent webinar with Sue Dyson last month, and she was saying it's very much about being able to read our horses and also be able to understand if clearly if a horse is in pain, then we need to identify where that is and why that is, but also a horse's ability and what we're asking him to do. We need that horsemanship of being able to read what our horses are telling us too.
Exactly.
Mark, do you find that sport horse performance changes coming out of a particularly harsh cold winter as opposed to a mild one?
If what changes, sorry?
Does sport horse performance change coming out of a particularly harsh or cold winter as opposed to a mild one?
I don't think their performance changes. I mean, it depends how the horse itself comes out of the winter. I think a harsh winter. I would imagine if it's a sport horse, a performance horse, then it's probably been stabled most of the winter, and so you're able to sort of monitor and control the level of condition and feeding and fitness of the horse. So theoretically, it shouldn't really change the level of the performance.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. Jon's a question, if your horses are out 24/7 and might have metabolic issues, they don't say what advice would you give? They're strip grazing, and I would do in the spring, but I'm concerned about the frosty grass. So what advice we've obviously talked about frosty grass, but what advice can we give people who horses are out and potentially have metabolic issues?
So again, it's a sort of a weight issue, and whether you could consider perhaps setting up a track system rather than the strip grazing. So that a track system going around the outside of your field, where you have the hay at one end and the water supply at the other, just to keep the horse moving constantly and having to walk. That's sort of half the battle, because the trouble that people find, obviously in the summer, if the horses aren't at work, you strip graze them on such a small area to limit their intake, but then they're not getting any exercise. So you're better off really using a track system. I mean, I think people will have to use grazing muzzles and things like that. If you want to give them more grass, it may be that you're going to have to use a grazing muzzle again in the winter. And again, if you do use the track system, once they graze it down, instead of using normal, putting in hay or haylage, introduce your barley straw and your oat straw, and just try and keep them moving as much as possible.
Mark, thank you, Jon. I'd be fascinated to know your answer to this one. How can we stop muddy gateways?
Well, there's no real cheap alternative. Well, the cheapest alternative is most gateways are in a corner, and then horses tend to congregate there anyway. So what we have done in cases like that, you get a bit of electric tape and a couple of standards, and you cut off that corner of the gateway, so you don't actually have mud in the gateway itself. You then tend to have a wider, less muddy area away from it, but at least your gateway is not muddy, so you can get in and out on decent ground. I mean, the other thing that and which sort of Jon brought up in a dry platform areas, if you're and the best time to do it is in the summer when it is dry, is to get a contractor and dig out your gateway, put down some gravel surface, so that you've actually got a hardcore surface in the gateway.
Brilliant, thank you. Jon, I'm just looking at, and someone's referred to the winter welfare tips that we've got on our website, and we talked about rugging. And here we've talked about, don't automatically think just because it's cold outside your horse needs a rug. But you talked in your presentation around having a thin rug that can actually just prevent issues like rain scald. For people who are thinking about rugging, what sort of questions should they ask themselves?
Well, I mean, all horses have already got a winter rug on, basically. If they're not clipped, they've already got a waterproof winter coat. So generally, under normal circumstances, particularly if it's a native pony, they actually probably won't need a rug. Most of our centres live out all year without rugs, including up in our Scottish centres. So, but obviously each horse is an individual. So if it's an older horse, or it's a horse that's in poor condition, or if it's ill, and the old adage is a thin horse is a cold horse. So if it is thin, if it's underweight for whatever reason, it may need to have an extra rug on. But if it's a generally fit horse with a full winter coat that hasn't been clipped, then generally in this climate, most of them will survive quite happily without a rug. The most important thing is the feed, and it's got access to forage, because they have an internal burner system, a bit like an internal central heating system. So as long as they've got that food going in, they'll heat themselves from the inside out. And it's why you see the pictures of the moorland ponies down by me on Bodmin and Dartmoor. They're walking around with snow on their backs, and they're warm as toast, but they're so well insulated, they don't really feel it. But where in my tour, I was talking about when the weather is really wet, persistent for weeks and weeks and weeks, and that's when you can get issues like rain scald, particularly on the thinner skinned horses, such as Mark was talking about. Yeah. So that's when then they can still cope probably weight wise without having a rug on, but you may want to put a lightweight one on just to stop the rain. And like I say, when they lie down and they roll, it'll take the brunt of the mud.
Question here for you, Mark. Any tips for people hoping to get back to low-level eventing in 2021 after the year of 2020?
Well, that's a sort of open question, isn't it? we can all hope that things return to some sort of normality, and I think the key is you've got to. I'm like to think I'm a bit of an optimist and believe that things are going to come right again. And so I think you need to have your horse ready and prepared that, when it does open up, that you can get back into it.
Yes, and you talk, Mark, about rugging and not thinking about your horse in terms of how we think as people. Horses are horses. In terms of how do you go around in terms of your management over the winter? What's your decision-making process? For example, whether to rug a horse or not?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's I was brought up in New Zealand, and although we probably have a milder climate generally than here in the UK, we always used to rug our horses. We had the old-fashioned New Zealand rugs, those great, awful, heavy canvas things that used to weigh a ton. But now with modern fabrics, and because most of my horses, well, all of my horses now are thoroughbred. And they do generally tend to be thinner skinned. They do generally tend to be younger. It's just a personal thing. It makes me feel better that if I'm inside in the warm and it's peeing down with rain, that my horse isn't standing out there without a rug in the cold. So they all have rugs on. But, I agree with, Jon, that if they're not a thin-skinned thoroughbred and they're not underweight and everything else, they don't need a big, thick, heavy rug on. They do grow their own coat, and they are probably healthier for being in a more natural state.
And thank you for that, Mark. What are they called? I just suddenly thought, were New Zealand rugs invented in New Zealand?
Who knows? I don't know how, but I was amazed when I first came over here that there was New Zealand rugs. Yeah. They didn't look anything like our New Zealand rugs, but they were called New Zealand rugs. And now that I actually have involved with the company that produces rugs, so things have moved on, and the quality of fabrics and everything else is much better than those old canvas things.
Yeah, too true. And the horses are very grateful too. We're almost out of time. I know the answer to this, but since Emma's asked it, Jon, I'm going to give it to you. Is there any plans? I mean, it's a really good question. Is there any plans to support horse owners with the changing climate, to provide riding arenas, all-weather riding arenas, and turnout, as local councils need to support this?
Well, it'd be nice, wouldn't it? But yeah, I don't know whether as things go on, I don't think I certainly haven't heard of any councils or anything offering that at the moment. So I think they've probably got other priorities at the moment that they'll deal with, sadly.
And I suppose one of the key areas where local councils is in being able to provide that. The British Horse Society are doing a great job in trying to get sort of public bridleways, remarked, and so there can be network of places for horses to ride throughout the year.
I think it's amazing in this country, the with the bridle ways and the sort of farmers that have their land where you can go and go around and jump little courses. There are, if you have transport, there are an amazing number of places you can take your horses to do these sort of things.
Well, that's interesting. So actually, from your perspective, you think there are, I mean, I suppose the key thing there is...
certainly have nothing like that in New Zealand, no.
Brilliant. Well, listen, I've loved it. We could go on forever, but we've come up to time. So in terms of, as ever, we've talked about a lot of things, a lot of advice, and I hope the links we've provided for you have been useful, and do go and have a look on the World Horse Welfare website afterwards. Jon, in terms of what we've covered tonight, what are your take-home messages or final thoughts?
Just really to think about the way the climate is changing now, and think about your paddocks, and just be prepared and think when this happens rather than if, because it seems to be happening year upon year now. Yeah,
absolutely. And Mark?
Well, it's been an education for me too, because obviously I look at it from my own perspective, and hearing Jon talk. It's a completely different perspective. So I think the thing is that you've just got to, think of your own situation, your own horse's situation, and make a wise decision under your own circumstances.
Brilliant, and thank you. That's so true, isn't it, Mark? It doesn't. How long we've been involved in the business, actually, we're always learning, and we've always got to be open to new ideas.
And I think there's an awful lot of people out there that you can ask for help and advice, and don't be afraid to do that.
Well, what a great place to finish it. And so, listen, Mark and Jon, thank you so much for this evening. We've done some rich content now, and I know people are certainly great sort of feedback. So thank you for that. I know, Mark, you're coming back in the new year with Pippa Funnel to talk about sort of getting horses ready for the new season. So I think that's February time. So we look forward to seeing Mark back then. But Mark, in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and thank you to you, Jon, and a special thank you to everyone for joining us and for all the questions. They've come thick and fast, and I hope we've got through the majority of them, and I do apologise if we haven't. We're running these webinars every fortnight. Next one in 2 weeks' time, where we'll be focusing on laminitis. As we've already talked about, actually laminitis is as common in December as it is in the springtime. So do join us then. If you've enjoyed tonight, please do share it with your friends and colleagues. It'll be up on our YouTube channel. And if you've got any suggestions of future topics, as I said earlier, please do email us at education@worldhorsewelfare.org. We're 13 webinars in. As we've said, when we started in June, it was relatively early in the whole pandemic season. The news is a little bit more popular. God willing, it will be not popular, a little bit more positive. God willing, it'll get even more positive over the coming weeks. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining us. Have a great evening. Take care, and see you in a fortnight.